Hi everyone. Good that we're finally starting. My time slot should already be over, I think, but I won't take you too long, don't worry. So I want to talk a bit about NoSQL and security in that area. So I'm working for Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch and our other products. I was part of our infrastructure team. I've been moved around a lot. Now, I think my official title is developer advocate, but I always like to say developer avocado because it's kind of like more graphical. So who knows this page, dbengines.com? It's like the TIOBE index for programming languages, only this one is for data stores. So basically they have a monthly ranking which are the most popular or common data stores, which, yeah, you know, don't trust any sources because it's kind of arbitrary how they rank it, but they have like various sources how they combine the data. So they have job offers and searches on Google and posts on Stack Overflow and various other sites, and that's how they actually calculate these rankings. And the current ranking looks something like this. So you can see the relational databases are still sitting on top and kind of leading the way, but we have 4 NoSQL databases in the top 10. MongoDB being on top, then we have Redis, Elasticsearch, and Cassandra is kind of like falling down further and further. So I want to focus on the first 3, MongoDB, Redis, and Elasticsearch in that order. Okay, we're a very small group. Normally I do this, if you want to, you can totally still use that. I use Slido, so you can just post your questions there anytime and I will answer. If I don't have time at the end, I normally tweet out the answers. Feel free to post anything there, but since we were a small group, if there are any questions, just shout and I will try to react. So I guess most of you have seen this, the little Bobby Tables XKCD comic. Do you think this is still a problem for NoSQL data stores? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? I mean, you're both kind of right, since obviously there are no SQL injections if there is no SQL, but there are still injections in other formats, and we'll try to look at those as something. Or as some people, yeah, they like to say, like, the best argument for NoSQL is that there are no SQL injections, but that was a joke. Like, the person knows that scripting injections are still a thing, and you don't tweet at them like, no, there's still scripting injections. He knows it was more of a joke there. So I'll start off with MongoDB. Why? Because, well, probably you remember this one, it's web scale. You know, these 2 little animated, I don't know even what they are, bears or whatever, talking to each other in a computer-generated voice. And one was asking questions, and the other one was always answering like, but it's web scale. And that was kind of the marketing thing that MongoDB was putting in. Yeah, come on forward. I don't think we need anybody in the back. You're very far away otherwise. Yes, now that they have gone public, some people are joking that they don't only lose your data, but they can also lose your money, though their stock exchange value has been doing amazingly well. So what about security for them? Injections are still a thing. Maybe somebody remembers Diaspora. Diaspora was like, I think it was 8 years ago or something like that. It was supposed to be the Facebook killer, where somebody wanted to build a Facebook alternative. And they released some code based on MongoDB, and their queries in the code they put out looked something like this. This is a very bad idea for 2 reasons. One, this will be very slow, but because this is a regular expression, and you can see we have like start something, and then we do an I for ignore case. So we will basically run through all the strings and try to do a regular expression on that, which will be very slow. The other thing is, this also allows a string injection because, well, you're basically parsing in that query string, and if you terminate something, you can still do scripting injections. So this is not a good thing. You don't have SQL to do scripting injections, but MongoDB supports JavaScript. So you have a full programming language to do those, actually. And anywhere where you do something like this, I mean, eval is kind of the obvious one, but there are various things where if you run these methods, you need to sanitize your inputs. Otherwise, scripting injection. But you can disable scripting, and most of the time, or a lot of programming or programs that you have don't actually use JavaScript in MongoDB. And the same default would be to have it disabled by default, which they don't have. So right now, you still need to disable that, but that would be a good thing. And then you're getting rid of then you're getting rid of scripting injections in general. And then there was this thing, which is, no worries, this is the only German thing I'm using. But there was the University of Saarland, which discovered that there were 40,000 unsecured MongoDB instances. And at first, it was kind of like an academic problem because they were like, oh, this is bad, and you could find data, and we don't know what to do with it, but you could do bad stuff maybe. And then it takes some time until the bad guys figure out the way how to make money. And luckily, we have cryptocurrencies now, and they are like a great way to make money out of stuff like that. So you can see this was 2015, then it took like 2 years until people started to ransom data stores. Because basically what they did is they took a backup of the data, or at least they said they took a backup. That is always debatable if they really do that. And then they delete the data and just leave an entry there and say like, oh, if you want to have your data back, pay us X amount in Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency you want to have. And they did that to, I don't know, how many 10,000s of servers. Like that report found 27,000 infected servers where they tried to ransom somebody. Probably a lot of people don't pay up because it's just forgotten test instances, but quite some others might probably pay. So does MongoDB bind to all interfaces by default? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? So they used to, but they don't anymore. In 3.6, I think this is the stable release still, they have turned that off everywhere. Previously, if you were using the Debian or RPM packages, it had already been turned off for some years. So everybody who got ransomed kind of did two things wrong. A, they had their MongoDB instance on a publicly accessible instance, which you probably never should do. And B, they changed the configuration to bind to all interfaces. So it was not kind of accidentally you install MongoDB and you're kind of vulnerable to any attacks there. But you changed something in the configuration without changing your security settings. Is authentication enabled by default? Come on in, we have plenty of spaces. Yes, no? No, it is not. Talking about authentication or authorization, MongoDB is actually very good in that area. You need to enable it, which might take some. That is all you need to do. Basically, in the configuration, you need to set auth true or pass it as a parameter. They had their own implementation up until some time ago, but in more recent implementations for at least 2 or 3 years now, they have added a proper AUTH standard with Scram SHA-1. In the upcoming version 4, they are switching to Scram SHA-256. This is, by the way, the same thing that PostgreSQL 10 added. So they are using the same security mechanisms, which are kind of an official standard, and should work very well. So they're doing a lot of good stuff in that area. They have changed some configurations there, so this is doing all the right things. They also provide a lot of predefined roles. So if you just want to read data or you want to administrate your cluster or do things like that, that is all in there. So you might think you can do the happy dance and everything security-wise works well. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's kind of a dance to enable security in MongoDB. And just to show you that little dance, we're starting MongoDB without any authentication because we don't have any default credentials or anything. So what we're doing is we're starting the binary there, and then I'm setting up an admin user, Philipp, with the password, and I have the role root. So I set up, that is my initial user to administer the cluster. Then I authenticate. So I start MongoDB with -auth, so with authentication. I try to log in with Mongo localhost admin. Will that line work or will that line fail? Any guesses? Yeah, unfortunately, it lets you log in only as soon as you run any command. It will tell you that you don't have the right permissions. So then it will show DBs will fail, which is very weird for automation because you always assume like if you try to connect and you don't have the right credentials, it will fail immediately. But this is not the case here. It will just let you log in and only fail as soon as you try to run a command, which I found very tricky if I wanted to automate any setups. OK, so let's do the right thing. We're authenticating with our user that we have just set up, and we're creating Alice. And Alice can read the database A and read and write to the database B. Remember that? We'll need that on the next slide. So, so Alice is authenticating against the database now. I'm using the database A, so you can see that here I'm logging into the database A. I try to insert something. Will that work or will that fail? So the insert will fail because A was only the read-only database. So that will fail. The find will work. Then I switch to the B database with use test B. Will that insert work? Yes, because there we have read-write. The read will work if I use test C, so I switch to the C database. I did not set up any credentials for C. Will that use test C work? Yes, it does. Unfortunately, it does. However, as soon as you run any command against the C database, then the test find, that will fail again, because then you're not properly authenticated. But you can kind of switch to the database even though you don't have any permissions on that. Which again, that makes automation or what you expect a bit tricky. But this is the way they implemented their credentials. And TLS or SSL is now included almost everywhere. So encryption on the wire is there. So generally they have all the pieces. It's just you need to enable authentication, and it's slightly weirdly, the handling is slightly weird. Otherwise, MongoDB is actually doing a very good job there. Coming to Redis. Yes, sure.
Question about MongoDB. Am I right in thinking that Elastic disabled or stopped support for MongoDB sometime ago? Is that correct?
Elastic?
Yeah.
As in Elasticsearch?
Yes.
That there is no direct connection between, so the question was, did Elasticsearch stop the support for MongoDB? We never had any support between the two, like they're just two independent systems. Elasticsearch has its own backend. No, Elasticsearch has its own, so it's Apache Lucene that is writing out to disk. There is no other data store involved in the background. MongoDB is just independent of that. There's no, I mean, both are document stores, but otherwise there is no real connection. So we're more of a search engine, so, but both take JSON. Okay, coming to Redis. How do you think Redis security is doing? The same? Yeah, Redis security is interesting. So there was recently, an interesting report that said that 75% of the open Redis servers are infected. And infected, they actually mean mining cryptocurrencies. Because you could very easily break out of Redis to actually do other stuff on that instance. Lua. Yes, exactly, Lua. If you want to see how to do that, Salvatore, his domain is Antires, the author of Redis, he actually, like some time ago, he wrote a blog post how to actually break out of Redis and get access to the instance. You will need to do minor modifications to that, but he actually shows you how to get access to the underlying instance if you have opened Redis access to that. So yeah, since he's the developer, he even showed how to do that, just to warn people that they need to be careful for that. Does Redis bind to all interfaces by default? Yes, no? Yes, it does. Redis does. But they have added this thing called protected mode, which is actually very interesting. So in 3.2, which also came out some time ago, we're now at 4.0 something. What they're doing is, if you did not set up a password, only queries from localhost will be answered. Any remote queries will get back the answer, you need to set this up correctly. I'm not answering your query, I'm here, but you need to set this up correctly. They have some authentication, but there is no authorization. So actually their own documentation says a tiny layer of authentication. And you know, when your own documentation says a tiny layer, it's probably really, really tiny. So what you do is you can set up one password in the configuration file, and that's it. And there's one password for the entire server. So basically what you then do is to run any command, you run auth, the password, and the command. It's stored in the configuration file in plain text, and there is no encryption on the wire and no rate limiting. And you know the nice thing about Redis is that it's very fast. So if you can do 15,000 requests a second, you probably should pick a very good password because you will be able to brute force at that rate, and there is nothing to limit your requests. So that one password should be pretty strong. The other very interesting thing they have is hiding commands. So what they have is you can set that in the Redis configuration, and you will need to restart your server to change that. Basically what you do is, if you want to change the command, let's say config, you run rename command config and then give it another name. And afterwards, you will only be able to access that functionality through my secret config name. So you need to know that other name, which does not really hide it, or it does hide it somehow, but it doesn't protect it in any way. So you need to know that name. What some people have been doing is they are hashing with some other key the command names. So they just rename some commands, and they always know, okay, this is what I need to do to get back to that original command. And they kind of, yeah, it's a bit like obscurity through obscurity, because you're basically hiding the commands. What you can also do is you can give the command an empty name. So this is an empty string. Then it's just gone. You cannot use that command anymore. This is their way of disabling specific commands. For example, there is a command to remove or to delete all the keys in Redis, which you probably don't need in production. So you might just disable that, so nobody can even accidentally run that. Yeah, and don't pass in random Lua scripts, because then you will have the same scripting injections again. And this was just like at the beginning of this month, Salvatore published another post where he said that Redis eval, he sees that as kind of a fundamental feature, and this is enabled by default and will stay enabled by default. But of course, if you can pass in anything into an eval function, it will run whatever you pass it in, and there are no security restrictions around that anymore. So do that at your own risk. The future is, in that same blog post, he also, Salvatore also said that he will add some access control lists and encryption, SSL or TSL, in version 6. However, we are at 4 right now. 5 is under development, so 6 will be some time out, and we'll see how long it takes and if it even makes version 6. So we'll see. But that is the plan. OK, coming to Elasticsearch. Does Elasticsearch bind to all interfaces? Yes, no. It did. It does not do anymore. So up until version 2, we did bind to all interfaces, but we changed that because, well, we learned that this was not helping everybody. We also had this other very interesting feature that it was broadcasting on this local subnet to find other instances. We stopped doing that as well, because there is one very nice scenario around that. So by default, if you bring up Elasticsearch, it will start broadcasting on the local subnet to find any other Elasticsearch nodes. And if they have the same cluster name, and by default the cluster name will be Elasticsearch, they will form a cluster, which is very cool for demos. The problem is some people did not configure the cluster name correctly, and then did some very bad stuff. For example, there were cases where people VPN'd to their production setup, and they had Elasticsearch running locally with the default name, and then in production they had the default name as well. And then if you VPN to that, your local instance might form a cluster with your production cluster. And then if you think you run any command against localhost, like delete everything, that runs against production. So that's why we are now very explicit in your configuration. You will need to say, I want to form a cluster with these IP addresses or DNS names. And we will not form clusters automatically anymore, just for cases like that, which might happen. Does Elasticsearch run as root? Any guesses? Yes, no. No, we don't do that, because we think that no process should, or no server process should run as root. We use a high port, so you don't need the permissions to bind to a low port. Port is 9200, so we don't need root permissions for that. And we just system exit if you try to run it as root. So we'll really not do that. And sometimes people are very unhappy about that. For example, if you run Docker, I met a lot of people who were like, oh, now that we're using Docker, it's kind of like in the container. We don't care about that anymore. We want to run everything as root in the container, which we still disagree with. And we always call these the cockroaches. Those are the ideas that disappear for a while, and then they just come back. So running stuff as root, as a server process, was accepted to be a bad practice. Now with Docker, people are trying of like reinventing that. We still don't do that. If you want to run Elasticsearch as root, you will need to fork the source code and comment out the system exit that we do when we see that you're running as root. That is your only chance, and we will not change that, even if people complain. We had scripting as well, or we have scripting. So these are all the security issues we had in Elasticsearch, the open source Elasticsearch. And we didn't have some for quite some time because A, we changed something around security, and B, I think we're the only larger Java project that is using the Java Security Manager, which protects you, for example, from a lot of serialization bugs. So we've learned our lesson there. If you just take a look at what was related to scripting, you can see those 3 of the 7 security issues that we had, and the most severe ones, they were all related to scripting. And most of them were related to Groovy, because Groovy was very easy to add since it's a JVM language, and it's just scripting language you can add easily. However, Groovy is a general purpose programming language, and it turned out to be very hard to sandbox. And people found creative ways to break out of the sandbox every now and then. So what did we do? We started our own scripting language called Painless, because the author of that scripting language has chronic back pain and he just wants to have something that is not painless. And we also want to take out the pain of scripting. So what we did is we hired a developer and he developed Painless for a year, and then we added that. Common question is like, do you really need another scripting language? And he wrote a blog post about that and why we think that adding our own scripting language here that is very close to Java. So if you know Java, the syntax will feel very familiar. Did it really pay off to add that? And for us it did, because we had 2 main objectives, which were security. Since it's kind of like whitelisted, only these things are possible. You cannot do these other things that help security. Also performance-wise it helped, because Groovy, if I remember correctly, needs to be interpreted every time you run a script. Whereas our Painless scripts are cached, so we basically cache the bytecode. Once you run the script, it will be cached and it will be faster for every consecutive run. Yeah, this is just to give you an idea how scripting looks like. Basically, this is an upsert, so if we don't have any value for the +1s, we will set it to 1. Otherwise, we will do a ++ on the +1s to increment them. This is how you can kind of like simulate an upsert. Pretty easy. We had other scripting languages, mostly Groovy, but Python, JavaScript as well. We did remove them in the current version because security, performance, and we just wanted to kind of like lower the attack surface. Do we have authentication and authorization? We do, but that's how we pay our salaries. So just to give you an idea of how that might look like. So everybody knows Shodan? Shodan is like a search engine, but for devices or things on the internet. So basically, it crawls the internet and tries to find stuff. What I'm doing here is I'm looking for port 9200, which is the default Elasticsearch port, which responds with 200 OK. So I'm looking basically for open Elasticsearch instances. And then I think this one here, or maybe I scrolled down a little further. I basically picked one IP addresses with an open instance, and then I basically let it show me all the data that it has. And the one thing that is sticking out here is that please read. And that please read contains 1 document. So, well, since we're nice, we'll try to read please read. And what please read says is, your database is backed up at our server. Pay us 0.5 bitcoins to restore your data to that address. So that's what the typical ransomware attack looks like. I'm pretty sure by now most of the servers are only honeypots or forgotten test instances because everything got ransomed already. But you can find messages like that. Depending on the Bitcoin price, this can fluctuate a bit. I think this Bitcoin price is already like a month old. I've seen that at some point, especially like at that height, people were switching back to dollar values and said like, send us the equivalent of that amount in dollars because it would change from one day to the next so much. And nobody was able to keep up like how much should they pay. So that's when they switched back to dollar equivalents. The other very interesting thing is matryoshkas. So somebody ransoms your server, probably takes a backup of your data, and then leaves a message, please pay up here. And then the next trip comes, and again backs up your data and leaves another message, please pay up. And basically it's like one inside the other. And you don't really know how many you would need to pay to get back to the people who might have your data originally. So that is a real risk here, since this is all automated. Somebody might just take your data and you don't know who actually has your data and who might be able to give it back to you. So once you get ransomed, you're in a very bad spot. Don't get there. Also, we have our own internal test instances. And for example, the German CERT, they're scanning German hosting providers and IP addresses. And once somebody exposed an unsecured Elasticsearch instance, and that is the email that they send out. So they're sending out alerts as well, but they might be slower than some ransomware attack. So don't rely on anybody else finding that. But they will kind of like tell your hosting provider, and your hosting provider will then forward that to you to tell you, okay, maybe your Docker test node 1 needs some security. So you might get those warnings as well. Okay. By default, Elasticsearch only binds to localhost. So everybody who gets ransomed needed to change something in their configuration. This is by now the same for MongoDB, Redis, which has like their protected mode, but we also only bind to localhost anymore. Generally, any data store should probably only be on a private IP address and not be accessible from the internet, because normally there's no good reason to have that. I've met people who said like, oh yeah, we had a firewall, but then we misconfigured the firewall for 15 minutes or something like that. And in the meantime, we got ransomed, even though the firewall was only down for 15 minutes. So don't rely on your firewall, just have it on a private subnet and be done with any public security issues. Firewall can help, does not always help, so this is kind of like only one more layer you should add. You could use a random port. I've kind of grayed this out because, well, this is not going to protect you. This is just like making the attack a bit slower, or if they find somebody else, they might just ransom them and not find you, but this is not going to protect you. If somebody wants to find it, scanning all your ports in your service will be pretty quick. You can proxy everything since, well, it's HTTP, so any reverse proxy for HTTP will work, like Nginx. You can terminate TLS there. You can have basic auth. That is normally all you need. We do have something that ties into your cluster and, bless you, and adds some more security features, single sign-on, document field level security, more stuff like that. However, that is one of our commercial features because, well, it's more of an enterprise thing and that's how we pay our salaries. And always take a snapshot or backup of your data. So you don't rely on somebody else giving you your data back maybe, but just saying like a worst case scenario, okay, we have lost 20 minutes of data, fuck it. We'll just restore from backup and we will protect our data better. So to wrap up, injections are still a thing. Just because there is no SQL doesn't mean there is no SQL injection. Security should be enabled by default, but I think this is a learning process. And the NoSQL data stores are not there yet. It took MySQL and Postgres also some time until they had that enabled by default. And it feels like every system needs some time until it gets there. Creativity is interesting, especially around Redis, like the protected mode and hiding commands. I'm not sure it's really a good thing, but it is at least an interesting approach. Custom scripting, at least in our opinion, can make sense. And security just takes time. It's more of a learning experience, and I think every system sooner or later gets there. Any questions? Did anybody get ransomed? No, nobody is admitting it. I did have people in the audience in the past who said that they got ransomed, but they always said, oh, it was only a test database, so we did not care. Nobody got ransomed? Yeah, or maybe you don't know because it's some forgotten instance and nobody knows that anymore. Yeah. Okay. Normally I take a picture with you so I can prove to my colleagues that I've been working, because they don't really know where I am normally. This is not a great place. Wait, because I'm not sure. Wave. Very nice. Last chance for a question.
Do you have any data about Cassandra? Is it secure?
Well, secure. I've seen ransomware attacks for Cassandra, even Hadoop, where I wonder, like, nobody can probably take a backup on the side of, I don't know how many terabyte Hadoop cluster. But like basically what people probably do is they just delete the data, leave the message, and hope that somebody pays up. But yeah, I've seen reports for Cassandra, Hadoop, anything that is open. Basically, thanks to cryptocurrencies, people figured out a way how. So anything that is unsecured will be abused. And if you can even mine cryptocurrencies on the instance, then because you can somehow run commands, people will also do that. But
what about the relational databases?
I mean, the advantage of relational databases is that they generally force you to have security enabled, and you will need to.
All passwords.
Right, but I think even MySQL changed it, and you need to specify a password, at least for the defaults on most operating systems. I think you need to enter one. Sure, if you pick a bad one, but I don't think. I mean, brute forcing is probably a thing, but as long as people have totally unsecured data stores, people will attack those first. But yeah. Generally, I think that the main advice is like don't put on an internet reachable instance, because there is normally not much point to that. Like just lock it down. Yeah, I think anything that can be attacked will be attacked. Just security in a NoSQL space is not that mature yet, or it's kind of still improving. That's why it's being most commonly attacked. But like the kind of data store doesn't make any difference. Whatever can be attacked will be attacked. And I think MySQL had that problem like a few years ago. They just learned the lesson and enabled security now. I guess the NoSQL stores will learn the lesson too. Eventually, yeah. It's a learning experience. And I think there are no shortcuts. Cool. Thank you.